one name for this age no one can argue. This is the nuclear age. The age of the always present threat of instant and total annihilation. How did we get here? How did it all begin?
Welcome to Season 2 of Press the Button, The Shadow of Oppenheimer. This season, we will talk about who was left behind in the pursuit of a false sense of security. This story starts in 1945 with one man, J. Robert Oppenheimer, but the people affected total in the millions, and the fallout of that decision continues to this day. I'm Jacqueline Shing, the editor of the podcast.
And I'm Angela Kellett, the executive producer. Throughout this season, we will look at the shadow left behind by Oppenheimer and the lives that exist within that shadow, impacted communities, nuclear workers, and more. We will also look at the way pop culture, specifically the Christopher Nolan film, tends to focus solely on the man, not those left behind in the shadow.
So far this season, we have talked about what you need to know ahead of watching Oppenheimer and what we thought of the film. Let's look at specific examples of nuclear weapons being used and their consequences.
The Trinity Test is a major plot point of the film, if you want to call it that. As you watch, you can see the creation of Los Alamos, the site of the first nuclear test ever conducted. The Trinity Test is even shown on screen, but what you don't see are the people. You don't see the people who were either relocated from their homes or didn't know about a nuclear weapons test that was taking place. Something at the time that was unmanageable. You also don't see the after effects. It takes a long time for the communities who were not informed of the Trinity Test risk to realize that their residents are becoming sicker at higher rates. When infant mortality starts to rise, you don't see the baby graves. The impact of the test on the land and community is not visible in the film.
78 years later, these impacts continue to be felt. It is still a struggle for radiation-exposed people to be acknowledged and compensated. For the first time, people in New Mexico will be included in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, also known as RECA, after a vote in the Senate on Thursday, July 28th. This is the 13th year that the bills have been introduced in the U.S. Senate and House, and it was the first time there was ever a floor vote. If the bill passes in the House, qualifying downwinders and uranium miners could receive up to $150,000 in restitution and their medical costs completely covered.
So that's some really good news. It's been a long fight, but it's nowhere near over. But this is a moment for joy, and for us to know that calling your representative, calling your senator does matter. Remember, it passed in the Senate, but it still needs to pass in the House this fall. And for those who may not know the terminology, downwinders refer to individuals and/or communities that were exposed to radioactive contamination or nuclear fallout due to nuclear weapons testing, the uranium industry, or nuclear accidents. It's important to note that prior to this latest iteration of RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, many individuals who had been affected did not qualify. This is why advocates have been working to get a stronger and longer legislation passed.
Those in New Mexico, who now may finally qualify for compensation under RECA, while those stories may not have been told during the film, they can be told now.
Well, because the Manhattan Project had been established prior to Trinity, New Mexico was shortlisted. Other states like California, Texas, Colorado, Arizona were under consideration. Other locations in those states were under consideration for Trinity. But the reality is, because the Trinity site was already under government control, it was part of what was then called the Alamogordo Bombing Range, which is now called White Sands Missile Range. Because that area was already under governmental control, and because it was about 160 miles, I guess, from Los Alamos, they decided that it was the easiest place and the most convenient place to go ahead and test the bomb.
That was Tina Cordova, a sixth-generation native New Mexican born and raised in the small town of Tularosa in south-central New Mexico. which is 40 miles downwind of the Trinity Test blast site. You first heard Tina tell her story last season during Taking Back the Narrative. She has been advocating for her community for decades and educating others about what usually isn't being told about the creation of Los Alamos Laboratory and the atomic bomb in New Mexico. The successful detonation of the Trinity Test on July 16, 1945, the world's first nuclear weapons explosion, marked the beginning of the atomic age. The plutonium device, which they called Gadget, was detonated 100 feet in the air, releasing 20 to 22 kilotons of TNT, casting fallout across an area nearly 250 miles long and 200 miles wide. Most retellings of history of the Manhattan Project will say that New Mexico was chosen because it was empty, and therefore perfectly suited the needs of the project. The truth is, the site wasn't isolated.
There has always been a narrative, though, that it was chosen because it was remote and uninhabited, because they believed that no one lived there, no one would be harmed. But we know from census data, and actually a project taken on by a young student at UNM, his name's Brian Kendall. He took the 1940 census data, overlaid that on a map of New Mexico, and then drew radiuses around Trinity at 10-mile increments so that we would have some idea of what the population base was based on 1940 data, which in 1940, it was probably somewhat lower than 1945 because our population was growing rapidly then. And what he found is that no one lived within a 10-mile radius, but at 20 miles, there were families living there. And at 50 miles, there were close to 15,000 children, women, and men living adjacent to Trinity. And then at 150 miles, it encompassed Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north and El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south. It went all the way to the Arizona border to the west and almost to the Texas border to the east. In reality, it was our entire state. And you were then talking about 500,000 people living adjacent to the Trinity site. So the idea that it was chosen because of its remoteness is actually not accurate and speaks to the idea that they either didn't care about the people that lived here, or in some ways, they didn't see us. We didn't count. They didn't see us. And if you think about the history since Trinity, the second option, they didn't care, they didn't see us, is probably more likely true.
In creating Los Alamos National Laboratory, families were forced off their land and home, and other residents of the surrounding areas went to work for the Manhattan Project as babysitters, maids, construction workers, janitors, and technicians. But they didn't know about the bomb, and they never had a chance to protect themselves.
There was no warning given to anybody before or afterwards. We were not told to protect ourselves. We were not given the option to leave or to change our lifestyles. This is one of the things that bothers me the most, actually, about how the test was conducted. My mom said something very profound once in an interview. What she said was, do you think that if I had known I would have raised a family here, my husband and I would have done everything to move ourselves away before we had children? At least giving us an opportunity to protect ourselves afterwards, that's about the least we could have asked for. And even that didn't happen. And the government really never returned. I have been told anecdotally by many people that the government did return and that they did do soil and water sampling, but we've never been provided any kind of results of those tests.
And because of that, generations of families have suffered and continue to suffer.
My name is Mary Martinez White, and I'm a member of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Steering Committee. My home of Tularosa was 45 miles away from ground zero.
Like many other downwinders, Mary can trace the legacy of the Trinity Test through various cancers found throughout her family line.
So my link to the Trinity atomic bomb is that my immediate family and my extended family have all been significantly impacted with cancers due to overexposure to radiation. In my own family, my mother died of metastasized cancer. By the time they detected it, it was all over her body. My father died of leukemia. My oldest sister died of metastasized cancer, like mother. Another sister is a breast cancer survivor. A brother is a lung cancer survivor. And one sister is a uterine cancer survivor. I'm the youngest of 10 children, born in 1957. The folks that I mentioned, my mother, my father, and 4 siblings were alive at the time of the bomb.
These stories are unfortunately common in this community. Like Mary, Tina Cordova has a history of cancer and radiation-related illnesses in her family, which can be traced back to the Trinity Test fallout as well.
You know, I am the 4th generation in my family to have cancer since 1945, and now I have a 23-year-old niece who's the 5th generation in our family, and she has thyroid cancer, and those cancers are linked to radiation exposure. So this isn't going away. My family's not unique. We document families like mine all the time, and this is the legacy. So did it end with Trinity and the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Absolutely not. Like I said, we didn't experience casualties that I know of the day of the bomb, but it was the beginning of the end for a lot of people.
The initial justification for not warning New Mexico residents about the bomb's fallout was wartime secrecy. When ash from the Trinity Test fell from the sky, government officials and newspapers told residents that it was an ammunition magazine explosion from a local airbase. They only learned about the atomic bombs on the news with the rest of the country once it had been dropped on Japan. And still, even then, they were never told about radiation. They never knew that they would get sick, and when they did, they never knew why they were getting sick.
Well, I'm going to tell you a story that's in the history also that will give you an idea of how people viewed this in 1945, because I think it's important for people to understand that. There's a story in the history, and I think it was a rancher by the name of Ratcliffe. And people from Los Alamos showed up with Geiger counters in white Tyvek suits at his place. And he asked them, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're looking for radiation." And he said, "You're not going to find any because we don't own a radio." And so they counted on that. They counted on us to be unsophisticated, uneducated, and unable to stick up for ourselves. There was no realization of what radiation exposure meant. People didn't know. Even after they admitted that it was an atomic bomb that had been detonated at Trinity, it meant nothing to people. And there was never an explanation. There was never information shared so that people had a reality.
It's hard to advocate for yourself when you don't know that you have to. Currently, New Mexicans affected by the radiation fallout from the Trinity Test are not compensated by RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, even though some other downwinders from surrounding states are.
They established this Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, and they decided at the time to compensate citizens downwind of the Nevada test site in Utah. And at the time, New Mexico wasn't even considered because the lead attorney for the class action lawsuit was Stuart Udall, a very prominent American. And his son, Tom Udall, was senator from New Mexico at the time. And I asked Tom, well, why wasn't New Mexico included? And he said his father had not received any request from a citizen of New Mexico to join the class action lawsuit. And so that process, I think, reflects the fact that the citizenry at the time was more or less unaware of the implications of the Trinity nuclear test.
That's Dr. Joseph Shonka. He has a PhD in nuclear engineering and health physics from Georgia Tech, and he's worked his career in radiation protection. From 2000 to 2010, Dr. Joseph Shonka worked on the Los Alamos Historical Document Retrieval and Assessment Project, also known as LADRA, on behalf of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. That report found that radiation releases from Los Alamos were significantly greater than ever officially reported or published to the scientific community. Concurring with downwinder testimony, this report also found that residents were never warned about the Trinity test nor provided safety or dietary precautions after the blast. And to add insult to injury, according to Dr. Joseph Shonka, health and safety files from the Manhattan Project were classified because they didn't want people to sue for compensation.
The reports on Trinity were largely all classified. In fact, because they were afraid of lawsuits, all health and safety files were locked away in Oppenheimer's office to prevent inadvertent release to the public or the press. And this goes on. The reports themselves were declassified in about the early 80s, right? As interest in this came up. And they also hired Barton Hacker, to write a book, The Dragon's Tail, Radiation Safety in the Manhattan Project. And he was brought into all of the Manhattan District sites, reviewed a lot of literature, talked to all the people, and wrote an extensive history. The one on Trinity, he says here, accordingly, Oppenheimer held the health group reports on Trinity even more tightly than normal. Segregated from other Trinity reports, they were released only at Oppenheimer's personal request. He wanted, so at least one of his colleagues believed, to safeguard the project against being sued by people claiming to have been damaged.
And people were damaged regardless of whether they knew it or not. It is devastating for downwinders and impacted communities to be denied compensation for so long. But when you talk to these communities, they do have a shared agreement on what a sense of justice might look like. And compensation in healthcare is the fundamental part of it.
I don't think there's anything more egregious than saying to us that it's going to cost too much to take care of us after this, after this infliction of destiny. I always tell people this, as soon as Trinity happened, this became our destiny. And we were not active participants. We were innocent victims. When the government says it's going to cost too much to include us, I always say it actually adds great insult to our already existing injury. The partial payment of restitution, that's $50,000 now, and that we're asking them to increase to $150,000 in the new bills, will never bring back all the people that we've lost. Will never restore the sadness, the suffering, will never make us whole. I always tell everybody the absolute truth of it is that when we're sick and dying and at the end of our lives, we'll spend everything we have to try to keep people here. Families have gone into great debt to do that. And then their loved ones pass and they're left with nothing but the debt. And so the partial payment of restitution is absolutely never going to offset all of our losses. I've known families that have lost every child in the family. I've known families that have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and have gone into great debt, like I said. And so the partial payment of restitution will never make us whole. The healthcare coverage is a very important component, and we need that because people live in rural areas. And I can't tell you how often I've heard about people holding fundraisers to try and gather up the money they need. And I know of one particular case right now in my little village of Tularosa where a family has been holding fundraisers to help them get their 2-year-old granddaughter to good doctors because she has eye cancer and they've had to take her eye. And I think, how can this be okay? How can they look away from us? How can we spend $50 billion a year maintaining our nuclear arsenal, just taking care of the nukes that we have now, not adding to it, not a new pit, not modernizing, nothing other than putting them to bed at night? And how do we tell a family like this family in Tularosa, how do we tell them that they're on their own? This is not our country's finest hour. These are hardworking, tax-paying American citizens, salt of the earth, who aren't asking for anything extraordinary. And that is really the hardest part about this. We've never asked for anything extraordinary. We're simply asking that the government come back and take care of the mess that they made.
Money for healthcare is life-saving, especially here in the United States.
So compensation would look like what other states have already gotten, and no more and no less. In particular, we are hopeful for clinics, rural area clinics that would help with early detection. Had my mother and my oldest sister had that opportunity, their outcome may have been different.
And this fight for justice and compensation is one that has been ongoing for decades. And that is decades too long. So I asked Dr. Shonka why it's been so hard for downwinders to receive compensation. He told us that when deciding if compensation for RECA should be expanded, Congress tends to rely on faulty scientific studies. And as a result, downwinders are left out in the cold.
That study relied on the National Cancer Institute's study of Nevada test site fallout, and it in turn relied on measurements made by the Public Health Service in 1951 and later, and continuing, which were primarily fallout trays. They'd put a square foot of fly paper, sticky paper, on a wood platform, leave it out for a period of time, a sampling time, and then take that paper back to the laboratory and analyze it for dust, which included fallout. And so that was a measurement of fallout starting in 1951. It didn't have any data from 1945 with the Trinity Test, but when asked by Congress, the National Research Council, the preeminent science body in the country, studied it for 3 years. On the report, there's 58 names on the cover, some of the prominent scientists in the country. It included consultants, reviewers, and supporters, but people who are contributed enough to have their name on the report. And they went through an exhaustive study. They were asked 3 different questions, and one question was, how should we do this? And they came up with a method for doing it that differed from the traditional method. But then they said, Congress said, should anyone else be included? And they said, well, no, if you look at the National Cancer Institute study, the highest dose received by anyone was 210 milligray, I believe, to the thyroid. This would be about 8 millisieverts, equivalent to the whole body radiation dose. Thyroid is a very small organ. And so they said, because of that, we don't think anyone else should be added to RECA. Ever since then, if a congressman wants to know, should anyone else be added? Well, how do they determine that? A lot of times they go to what's called the Congressional Research Service. And the Congressional Research Service will be asked, what about this RECA? Should anyone else be added? Right? And doing that, the Congressional Research Service always goes back to that National Research Foundation study. They give a comprehensive study what the legislative history was, what the legal history and backgrounds were, what the participants have been, how many participated, what was spent on the project. And then they go on to the question, well, should anyone else be added? They say, well, certainly not. The National Research Council authoritatively said no one else could possibly be higher, failing to recognize that the National Cancer Institute report they were relying on was faulty. It didn't have any tritium data in it at all. So that I think is why this whole thing is sort of log jammed, because anytime a congressman wants to know, they turn to the Congressional Research Service and other sources. And every time they get an answer from Congressional Research Service relying on an authoritative study, they say, well, no one else has to be added.
The lack of crucial and accurate data has made Trinity's fallout frustratingly hard for scientists to analyze, and the quest for justice by downwinders even harder. To put that into perspective, the fallout from the Trinity test is far greater than what was previously estimated. A new study from Princeton, led by Sebastian Philippe, mapped radioactive fallout from the United States nuclear weapons test and found that the fallout from Trinity was blown by wind to 46 U.S. states, Mexico, and Canada within 10 days. And while the study's authors acknowledge that uncertainties within their calculations may exist, they maintain that their estimates are likely to be, quote, conservatively low, end quote. When you take a step back and look at these communities who have fought for decades to get compensation, and to simply track the data of those impacted, one wonders how they feel about the film Oppenheimer, which focuses on the Trinity test but left out their voices and left out their stories.
New Mexico was not uninhabited. Pajarito Plateau, as is depicted in the movie, was not vacant. There were people living there. There were plowed fields. We have stories from grandmothers of affected community who, motioned and said the bean crops were this high in the field. And we were told to get in our wagons and get off the land. And the same is the case for White Sands Missile Range. There were ranches. I worked with one of the women whose father owned Lucero Lake, the property on which is adjacent to the Trinity site. His family was asked to vacate the property. And that was the case with the Coxes, with, many ranchers that were displaced because of White Sands Missile Range.
People in New Mexico were horribly harmed as a result of the Manhattan Project and the Trinity Test. I tell everybody, without the people of New Mexico, there would have been no Manhattan Project. And let me explain. All the infrastructure, it was New Mexicans, natives, Hispanics. We were the ones that were bussed up to Los Alamos. The women changed every diaper, made every baby bottle, cooked every meal, cleaned every house, and have never been acknowledged. It was their husbands that were bussed up there to do the dirtiest work, clean the filthy instrumentation of radiation. Some of them lost their lives in explosive accidents. They'll never tell that in this movie. And then it was the New Mexicans that lived adjacent to the Trinity site. Who built the Trinity site? They'll never tell that part of the history either. And so this is an inconvenient truth. In filming this movie in New Mexico, in coming here to do this, in basically ignoring who we are inside of the Manhattan Project, is perpetuating a lie. And honestly, it's very exploitive. They'll make hundreds of millions of dollars off this movie. They came here, took our tax incentives. We're a poor state where 47% of the people here rely on Medicaid to access health care, highest in the nation. And they took our tax incentives. They invaded our lands and our lives to film this movie. And they walked away without telling the whole truth, because this is obviously it's been in the history of our country, continues to be today, an inconvenient truth.
This lack of reference to the native New Mexican community in the film, both on screen and in dialogue, leaves out another important part of the legacy of the Manhattan Project and the Trinity Test left behind. And that is, according to both Tina and Mary, the racial and socioeconomic disparity that lingers today.
Even now, there's this disparity that haunts the community. Throughout New Mexico, you have the haves who are quite wealthy and the have-nots. We have many military bases devoted to this kind of activity throughout New Mexico. Los Alamos has some of the highest wages in the world. In the valley below, you have some of the highest rates of heroin addiction in the world. And so those disparities are glaring. I think that we were largely people of color, Mexican Americans, and we were Native Americans. We were disposable, dispensable, collateral damage.
The first nuclear bomb the U.S. ever dropped was on itself, and people are still dying from this. To learn more about the stories of those radiation-exposed people in New Mexico, please visit trinitydownwinders.org. And if you want to learn more about RECA, please go to expandreca.org.
I say all the time now that when you have knowledge of this history and you remain complacent, you don't join with us in our fight to get the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act or RECA amended, and specifically it's House Bill 4426 and Senate Bill 1751. If you don't join with us in this fight and you remain complacent, then you're complicit in the injustice that has been imposed on us. Please join with us. Please recognize that this is an injustice. Please recognize that we have suffered long enough. We just went through the 78th anniversary of Trinity. Please recognize that we've been left here to deal with this long enough, and join with us in our fight to amend the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Contact your members of Congress and let them know that you want them to do this.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Angela Kellett and Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is Black Nymph by Peridot. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.